In the quiet Guildford office of Taurus Impact Systems, a small firm selling business databases, a phone rang one afternoon in the mid-'80s. On the other end, the computer giant Commodore, who, as the story is told, had dialed entirely the wrong number. They were looking for a networking firm, Taurus, but instead reached Peter Molyneux. Sensing the potential for free hardware and a valuable distribution deal, he simply didn't correct them, bluffing his way through the call. This founding lie, much polished by decades of retelling, became the industry's favorite origin story, the moment one man accidentally talked his way into video games.
In the rather less glamorous world of 1980s business software, Peter Molyneux and Les Edgar ran Taurus Impact Systems. They built databases for companies who needed to track invoices, manage stock, and print reports, the digital plumbing of 1,000 small offices up and down the country. It was a world of sensible spreadsheets and detailed manuals, a far cry from the pixelated adventures that would soon make their name. But that unexpected phone call, the one that went to the wrong number, had quietly changed the trajectory of their small operation. Suddenly, the focus shifted from quarterly reports to something rather more exciting, a tentative exploration into what microcomputers could really do, beyond mere accounting. The database men, it seemed, were about to become games men, whether they entirely meant to or not.
And so this enduring legend goes, a simple misdial on a telephone line accidentally rerouted two Guildford businessmen straight into the chaotic, colorful world of video games.
But this accidental entry was only the beginning. From that broom-covered office, tucked above a Guildford hi-fi shop, a decade would unfold that defied all expectation. In just 10 years, these two unlikely partners would accidentally conjure an entire video game genre and sell over 4 million copies of a single game. They'd be mobbed like rock stars on a bewildering trip to Japan, bring aboard a teenage programmer who would one day win a Nobel Prize, and sell their fledgling company to the American giant Electronic Arts for a reported $44 million. What followed, however, was the slow, piece-by-piece erosion of everything that made BULLFROG, BULLFROG.
It would be, for a wonderful while, a glorious comedy of errors and invention, until...
Even the company's name felt like a happy accident. From their original business, Taurus Impact Systems, came the bull, and from Les Edgar's rather charming collection of ceramic frog ornaments which sat on his desk, came the frog. BULLFROG Productions, a world-beating studio, named after a business database and a shelf of knickknacks. It was a perfectly absurd, perfectly British beginning.
In 1987, in the quiet Surrey market town of Guildford, two men, Peter Molyneux and Les Edgar, officially founded BULLFROG Productions. The name, as is often the case with these things, was a private joke, a nod to Edgar's personal collection of amphibian ornaments and an old business venture. Their first headquarters, for a company that would soon conquer the world, was not a gleaming corporate campus. It was rather a rather poky room above a hi-fi shop on Bridge Street, where one might imagine the bass from stereo demos vibrated through the floorboards. And as the story is sometimes told, the quickest route to their digital dreams involved walking up through an elderly lady's flat. A world-beating studio, it seemed, could begin life in a glorified broom cupboard, just a stone's throw from the latest in turntable technology. Inside that peculiar space, amid the hum of early computers and the distant thrum of hi-fi speakers, a small team began to gather. They weren't yet building worlds or defining genres, but rather taking on whatever work came their way, porting existing games, tinkering with code, simply keeping the lights on. It was a quiet, almost accidental beginning for a group of dreamers who, from this remarkably unassuming perch, would soon set their sights on conquering something far larger than just the next software contract. From this delightfully unremarkable perch, a team of young programmers and artists would soon begin crafting digital worlds that would resonate across continents.
At the heart of this burgeoning company, navigating the early chaos, was Peter Molyneux himself. A self-taught programmer, he possessed a boundless, almost infectious optimism and a charisma that could charm the birds from the trees, or, more accurately, convince potential collaborators of impossible digital futures. He was a man who could sell dreams to anyone, to the press, to his tiny team, and often, quite convincingly, to himself. In those early, scrappy days, this was less a flaw and more an essential skill. The ability to articulate a game so magnificent it barely existed yet, promising more than the current lines of code could deliver, was the most useful talent in the building. That gift for glorious hyperbole, for conjuring worlds not yet built, would prove to be the very fuel for BULLFROG's first improbable flights. This was the beginning of his story, an accidental businessman who would become a genre inventor, then a reluctant executive, and finally, a runaway founder. But for now, none of that grand arc had even begun. Peter Molyneux was simply a man possessed of an almost unreasonable amount of belief, convinced that digital worlds, however ambitious, could always be willed into existence. It was a potent, and sometimes perilous, conviction.
But if Molyneux was the irrepressible force of nature, the salesman of digital fantasies, then BULLFROG always had its anchor. Les Edgar, his co-founder, was the quieter partner, the steadying hand who navigated the labyrinthine world of business deals and licensing rights. While Peter dreamed up impossible worlds, it was Les who ensured the actual bills were paid, the contract signed, and that the company had the kind of sensible adult supervision that creative chaos often requires. He was the pragmatic counterpoint, the grounded half of a partnership that, as colleagues remember, was the true engine of BULLFROG's early success. The relationship between Molyneux and Edgar was the beating heart of the enterprise, a two-hander, a friendship between a visionary and a pragmatist. And as they set about building a new kind of empire, every triumph and every eventual heartache would fall to them both.
In 1988, amid the ongoing scramble of work-for-hire projects and ports that paid the bills, BULLFROG released something of their own, a game called Fusion. It was a modest debut, certainly not a blockbuster, but it brought them into contact with a name that would echo through their entire story. For it was Electronic Arts who published Fusion, a first handshake with the American giant, who in these early days would prove to be a powerful and benevolent force, a genie of sorts, granting the burgeoning studio the resources to dream even bigger. It was a partnership that would open doors to worlds beyond that little office in Guildford, and for a time, it felt like nothing could go wrong.
This initial success, however modest, meant the light stayed on, even if the office itself remained that cramped space above the hi-fi shop, now echoing with ever larger, more ambitious dreams.
Into this delightfully cramped space, a small but growing band of programmers and artists began to arrive. Glenn Corpus, whose idol Doodle would soon change everything, joined the ranks, as did Kevin Donkin and Sean Cooper, forming part of that foundational crew. The culture that flourished in this close-quarters environment was, by all accounts, a wonderfully chaotic affair. It was cramped and competitive, certainly, but also joyous, a place where everyone played everyone else's game, pushing each other to find new ideas. And the hours were long, but driven by pure passion, never by corporate mandate, as the team collectively willed impossible digital worlds into being. This was less an office, more a digital jam session, a band of codesmiths and pixel painters huddled together, each instrument a keyboard, each song a nascent game. They were a garage band, only instead of loud guitars and drums, their noise was the click of keys and the whir of disk drives, creating sounds and sights no one had quite imagined before. This intense, collective energy, fueled by tea and ambition, was the very bedrock of BULLFROG, a place where the next big hit was always just a few lines of code away.
And what was the instrument of this new digital orchestra? Often it was the Commodore Amiga, a beige plastic box that, as the story goes, Molyneux famously acquired through a wrong number. With its blinking cursor and surprisingly powerful graphics, it was the machine that truly opened up the possibilities of what a home computer could achieve. In its unassuming shell, a whole decade of digital innovation and BULLFROG's meteoric rise lay waiting to be unlocked.
In the unassuming chaos of the BULLFROG office, amidst the hum of early PCs, a programmer named Glenn Corpus was simply doodling. He wasn't charting a revolution or sketching a grand design. He was just letting his fingers play, pushing pixels around a screen, much as one might idly fold paper during a long phone call. Slowly, almost by accident, a landscape began to emerge, little diamond tiles stacked into a miniature, rising world. It was an absent-minded sketch, a digital screensaver waiting for a purpose, the kind of quiet, almost domestic little accident that could easily have been deleted and forgotten. Nobody was trying to invent a genre. They were just making interesting shapes move. But then Peter Molyneux saw it. Not just a pretty pattern, but a canvas begging for drama. What if, he mused as the story is told, we put tiny, bustling people on these lands? And what if, he continued, rather than controlling some lone hero, the player could simply be the hand of fate itself, to raise mountains at a whim, flatten valleys with a click, or summon floods and earthquakes, a god in a box, shaping creation itself. It was an idea so simple, so audacious, that no one had quite made a game like it before. They called it Populous, the very first god game, conjured from a moment of idle fancy and a programmer's wonderfully accidental blocks.
And so, almost without meaning to, a small Guildford studio had stumbled upon a brand new genre, one that would make gaming gods of us all.
What did being a god actually feel like? For the players of 1989, it meant gazing down on miniature worlds, watching your devoted little people mill about. With a flick of the mouse, land would rise beneath their feet, prompting them to construct tiny villages in your honor. Another click, and a very personal disaster might strike, a sudden earthquake, a conveniently timed flood, just to keep them on their toes and remind them who was truly in charge. You could command armies of specks across the landscape, or simply let your digital flock worship your divine, if occasionally capricious, finger. It was a peculiar, rather British sort of omnipotence, a celestial landlord, a benevolent tyrant, the one they prayed to for good harvest, or for a swift end to the neighbors.
This was a subtle omnipotence, though. You weren't clicking on tiny digital citizens to direct their every move. Your power was manifest through geology itself. Raise a hill, and they'd build. Lower a valley, and they'd scatter, before regrouping to found new settlements elsewhere. You shaped the world, and your little flock, with a charming lack of agency, simply responded to the contours of your will.
So here was this peculiar, powerful little game, born from a programmer's doodle and a designer's grand, slightly unhinged idea. But even a god game, however divinely inspired, needs a publisher to reach its worshippers across the globe. And in 1989, that publisher was Electronic Arts, who took this tiny, accidental world builder and dispatched it to conquer the burgeoning PC market. The precise details of that original handshake, as is so often the case with these charmingly chaotic early days, are now largely lost to the mists of history, buried somewhere in undocumented filing cabinets. Yet one quiet, crucial detail remained clear. Les Edgar, ever the steady, pragmatic hand behind the scenes, maintained control of Populus's vital licensing rights. It was a seemingly minor piece of business housekeeping at the time, but one that would, in the years to come, prove to be quite dramatically important indeed.
And so, from a tiny room reached, as the story is told, through a pensioner's flat, this peculiar little British god game was unleashed upon the world, ready to charm millions. From a place barely larger than a broom cupboard, where Les Edgar's collection of frog ornaments offered silent amphibian witness to the chaos, Populus was now a global sensation. 4 million copies. 4 million tiny worlds, boxed and shipped from Guildford, made their way into homes across the planet. It was an astonishing, unprecedented success, the very first British video game to ever break that 4 million mark. To think that such an immense cultural footprint began with a programmer's idle blocks and a designer's sudden, inspired whim, all within earshot, as the story is told, of a quiet elderly neighbor. It was an absurd, delightful, and profoundly British sort of world conquering. That unprecedented success, 4 million copies sold, meant a rather more tangible kind of transformation was now underway back in Guildford. For a studio still operating out of what some described as a broom cupboard, the royalty statements began to turn abstract sales figures into something wonderfully, amusingly real. As colleagues remembered, the mismatched furniture in their cramped office no longer felt quite so permanent, hinting at a future where even the office chairs might one day politely correspond. With 4 million copies flying off the shelves, it wasn't just players who were paying attention. The vibrant, opinionated world of the British games press, always on the hunt for the next big thing, suddenly had its sights set on Guildford. Magazines like Amiga Power and Edge didn't just review Populus, they became architects of its myth, and crucially, the myth of its creator. Peter Molyneux, with his boundless charm and even more boundless enthusiasm, proved a delightful subject. He spun tales of ambition and innovation, selling not just games, but the very idea of what games could be to a press corps eager for a new visionary. And so a powerful feedback loop began. The magazines amplified the dreams, and the dreams, in turn, fed the legend of Peter Molyneux genius. It was a joyous, symbiotic dance, establishing a reputation that would echo for decades. Though, as any keen observer of these things knows, the very same mythology machines that build up heroes can, with equal enthusiasm, begin to take them apart.
Having accidentally invented a genre, BULLFROG could hardly be accused of resting on its laurels. Their next trick arrived in 1990, Powermonger, a significantly more ambitious affair. It took the God game formula and hurled it into vast, polygonal, three-dimensional landscapes, a dizzying technical leap for the era. This wasn't just a sequel, it was an escalation, a defiant statement that the Guildford outfit wouldn't simply churn out more of the same.
With Powermonger, the studio began to forge its reputation as a place where technical prowess and inventive design were always pushing the limits, setting a course for a truly tech-first identity. They didn't just make games, they made new games. This was a truly enormous canvas for its time, a world you could spin and zoom through, even if the terrain itself, with its jagged peaks and valleys, had the architectural finesse of a particularly enthusiastic Lego set. It felt like holding a digital globe in your hands, full of tiny, blocky people you could direct to conquer all before them. A very British kind of omnipotence, perhaps. While the programmers wrestled with the complexities of digital omnipotence, Les Edgar, the quieter half of BULLFROG, was busy securing a very different kind of dominion. It was Edgar who licensed Populous to the Japanese publisher Imagineer, a move that would transform their modest God game into something utterly unexpected. Overnight, this quaint, blocky world from a Guilford office became a launch title for Nintendo's Super Famicom, the Super NES, across Japan. And with that, the team, a collection of polite British developers, found themselves on a plane to Tokyo, destined for a reception quite unlike anything they could have imagined. They arrived to a genuine rock star welcome, mobbed by fans, celebrated on television, bewildered by their sudden stratospheric fame. The architects of digital worlds, suddenly pop idols in a land of neon and manga. It was a gloriously absurd chapter in the BULLFROG story. The phenomenon wasn't just about sales, it was a full-blown cultural moment. Imagineer didn't simply publish the game, they unleashed a merchandising blitz that spawned comics, toys, and every conceivable piece of tie-in ephemera. But even that paled in comparison to the most delightfully bizarre honor bestowed upon the game. In a grand concert hall, a full symphony orchestra in evening dress would perform the simple, looping melodies that once accompanied tiny digital villagers on a screen. The chiptune soundtrack to a game sketched out in a broom cupboard, now given the full classical treatment. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated absurdity, a testament to how profoundly a little British God game had captured an entire nation's imagination. For men who had once coded in a broom cupboard, this sudden, unexpected elevation to pop star status was simply, wonderfully surreal. It was the comedy of accident, now writ large in neon. If Japan had embraced the God game with such theatrical zeal, Europe too was quietly falling under its spell. The sequel, Populous 2, shipped in 1991, adding more divine powers and slightly more complex landscapes for players to shape. It continued the original's runaway success, moving a further 1.5 million copies over its lifetime. But beyond the numbers, it was the sheer breadth of its appeal across the continent that truly mattered. From the frosty fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched markets of France and the industrious cities of Germany, these peculiar God games and management simulations traveled with ease. They didn't need heavy localization. The mechanics spoke for themselves. BULLFROG, it turned out, wasn't just a British anomaly, but a quietly growing pan-European asset. A fact, perhaps, for certain American publishers to keep in mind. With Populous 2, the developers clearly decided that if a little godly power was good, a lot more would be even better. They expanded the player's divine arsenal considerably, letting you conjure everything from volcanoes to plagues, subtly refining the formula. It was the God game, now at its most potent and playfully mischievous, offering an even grander canvas for digital creation and destruction. And across Europe, millions more were ready to answer the call. After the neon and adulation of Tokyo, the return journey to Guilford brought a very British kind of reality check. One day, mobbed by fans. The next, back at their desks in a quiet Surrey town, the rain, perhaps, rattling against the windows. The world had seen them as rock stars, but their daily grind remained, for now, a rather more modest affair, and perhaps, for the first time, a small, dizzying question of what came next. While BULLFROG's tiny Guilford office was still conjuring worlds, the narrative of this new British golden age was being written, quite literally, on the newsagent's shelf. Every month, titles like Amiga Power, Edge, and PC Zone landed with a thud, forming a kind of boisterous Greek chorus for the entire industry. These weren't just review sheets, they were the Mythology Machine, amplifying every groundbreaking idea, celebrating every genius, and, as the stories went, sometimes gently teasing out every grand claim. For a generation of players, they were the arbiters of taste, the chroniclers of pixelated dreams, and the very first place where the legend of a designer like Peter Molyneux would truly begin to be forged. They were the stage upon which a certain kind of charisma could truly shine, and eventually, where its dazzling ambition might start to look a little familiar.
Peter Molyneux, ever the raconteur, saw the blank pages of those monthly magazines not just as a chance for good reviews, but as an opportunity to dream out loud. He'd spin tales of worlds yet unbuilt, of features so groundbreaking they barely existed outside his own head, and the journalists, delighted by the sheer optimism, would print every word. They called him a visionary, a genius, a game changer. And as the story goes, Molyneux would read these glowing tributes, feel that particular rush, and immediately begin to dream bigger still, feeding the next grand ambition back into the hungry presses. It was a glorious, self-perpetuating cycle where the press and the visionary egged each other on. This was where the legend of Molyneux overpromises would quietly, charmingly begin to take root, though at the time it felt less like a flaw and more like an endearing promise of wonders to come.
Beyond the bullfrog bubble, the British Isles were buzzing with a peculiar kind of genius. Up in Dundee, DMA Design was busy spawning legions of suicidal lemmings, while Sensible Software charmed players with their tiny, heroic footballers. And Codemasters proved you didn't need a huge budget to make racing games sing. It was a chaotic, brilliant era, a true golden age where independent studios, often no bigger than a handful of friends, could conjure worlds from their bedrooms, or indeed above a Guildford hi-fi shop. These were the digital cottage industries, each with its own unique flavor, competing fiercely, but often sharing a knowing nod across the country. Yet, even as the accolades poured in, a faint rumble could be heard beneath the floorboards, the distant, inexorable march of consolidation. The question was quietly forming in every founder's mind: how long could a charming cottage truly remain a cottage when larger forces were beginning to cast such long shadows?
The industry was still a playground, but one where the bigger kids with the deeper pockets were starting to eye the best toys. The question wasn't if the bullfrogs of the world would be courted, but when. Across the Atlantic, a rather different kind of architect was quietly building simulations. In America, a calm chap named Will Wright, with his groundbreaking SimCity, was also fascinated by tiny digital lives, but perhaps with less of the theatrical flourish. He was the systems designer to Molyneux's Showman, a cool counterpart exploring the same grand obsession, giving players godlike power over virtual worlds. It was a fascinating transatlantic mirror where two very different temperaments defined a new kind of interactive play, a comparison that, as time would tell, would follow Molyneux for years to come. After the global success of Populous, a game that made players feel like benevolent deities, BULLFROG took a sharp turn. In 1993, Syndicate arrived, a dystopian vision of corporate warfare where trench-coated agents used mind control and brutal tactics to ensure profit. It was a severe tonal leap for a studio known until then for its cheerful gods and playful worlds. The game, critically acclaimed and a commercial hit selling some 2 million copies, seemed to signal a grown-up BULLFROG, as the industry press reported at the time. Yet the very scale of its success, built on such a ruthlessly cold vision, hinted at a different kind of ambition taking root, a colder edge to the studio's burgeoning chaos.
A game about the cold logic of expansion, of powerful entities consuming all in their path. The studio, for now, seemed to see no reflection of its own trajectory. The sleek, high-tech cities of Syndicate presented a stark contrast to the whimsical worlds that had come before. Here, players commanded a squad of 4 trench-coated agents navigating a grim, hyper-capitalist future where corporate loyalty was enforced with extreme prejudice. Their mission was total domination, achieved through any means necessary: mind control, targeted assassinations, and the cold, calculated efficiency of engineered violence. It was a brutal, beautiful simulation of power, where every conquest felt both thrilling and faintly unsettling. This darker vision, crafted with such precision by Alex Trowers and Sean Cooper, seemed to anticipate the very forces that would soon reshape BULLFROG itself. The studio was learning to build worlds of immense strategic depth, but the cost, though unseen, was beginning to mount. Behind the sleek, violent world of Syndicate, a different kind of engine was humming. Alex Trowers and Sean Cooper were central to its design, 2 master craftsmen among a growing assembly of talent. Jaunty Barnes and Simon Carter helped forge the complex systems, while Gary Carr, Paul McLaughlin, and Russell Shaw defined the studio's distinctive look and sound. This was the real BULLFROG, a room full of brilliant people building intricate worlds. Yet, as the studio's fame grew, so did the spotlight on its charismatic founder. The public, and a hungry press, increasingly attributed these collective triumphs to one name alone, a narrative that, as colleagues remember, sometimes obscured the quiet, painstaking work of many.
The chasm between public acclaim and internal reality was widening. While the press celebrated a singular visionary, the complex machinery of Syndicate was the product of many hands. Alex Trowers, a lead designer on the game, would later recall that Peter Molyneux had almost nothing to do with its actual development. This growing disparity, as colleagues observed, wasn't merely a matter of credit. It reflected a fundamental tension between the studio's collaborative spirit and the narrative demanded by a hungry public. A gap was opening up between the man who was the face of BULLFROG and the diverse, brilliant minds doing the work in the Guilford office. And such gaps, as history often shows, rarely stay quiet forever. With Syndicate alone selling around 2 million copies over its lifetime, the studio's hit-making capacity was undeniable. BULLFROG now commanded a dizzying range, moving effortlessly from benevolent gods to brutal generals, from playful theme parks to ruthless gangsters. Every genre it touched seemed to turn to gold. And somewhere in California, a very large publisher had started doing its own arithmetic. Their dizzying run of hits, their uncanny ability to turn any concept into gold, now marked BULLFROG as a prime target for consolidation. By 1994, the hits just kept coming. BULLFROG delivered Theme Park, a meticulously designed management simulation that turned the simple funfair into a global obsession. Players could micromanage everything from roller coaster prices to the precise length of an ice cream queue, an ingenious design problem, all concocted from a cramped screen in Guilford. It was another genre invented, another million-selling hit, pulling in 3 million copies and dominating sales across Europe. The studio, it seemed, could do no wrong, churning out runaway successes with an almost unnerving regularity. The laughter still echoed through the offices, but the grin on BULLFROG's face was becoming a little wider, a little more fixed, as the money and momentum built to a scale few could have imagined. This was no longer just a hobby that paid. This was an empire, and empires demand feeding. With Theme Park, the screen blossomed into a bustling canvas of calculated delight. Rides bolted into place with satisfying clicks, pathways unfurled like ribbons, and a ceaseless tide of eager, tiny visitors streamed through the gates. Beneath the charming cartoon surface, an intricate simulation whirred. Each virtual guest, every concession stand, every precisely priced hot dog, a cog in an engine of meticulously crafted joy. It was a dazzling, almost unsettling mastery of systems, where profit and pleasure were twinned,
built with a precision that felt less like improvisation and more like a vast, self-sustaining machine. The success was exhilarating, but the sheer demand of feeding such an intricate, beautiful beast was becoming immense.
But amidst the joyous chaos, a quieter kind of genius was at work. In a corner of the busy studio, a 17-year-old named Dimas Hassabis was meticulously crafting the very logic of the theme park itself. He was co-programming the complex simulations that made the virtual visitors feel alive, modeling their desires and frustrations, their flow through the gates. A boy teaching a computer how to build a bustling, profitable world, every variable accounted for, every impulse mapped. There was a cold, precise beauty to it, this intricate dance of data, a hint of something vast and powerful beginning to take shape, quietly, behind the scenes, almost unnoticed, in the very heart of BULLFROG's burgeoning machine.
It was from this modest desk, deep in the BULLFROG chaos, that a 17-year-old began to formalize the very chaos itself, building invisible systems that would orchestrate millions of simulated lives.
Even as Theme Park flew off the shelves, the studio was already pushing boundaries again. That very same year, 1994, saw the release of Magic Carpet, a dazzling technical showpiece that redefined what a 3D world could be, transporting players to a fantastical, flying realm of spellcasting and shifting landscapes. Two genre-defining hits launched within months from a single mid-sized studio in Surrey. This was BULLFROG at its absolute bewildering zenith, a chaotic, joyous engine where everyone played everyone's game, and the creative voltage was almost terrifying. The sheer, unceasing output was astonishing, a testament to a collective passion that blurred the lines between work and life. They were conquering the world, yes, but the pace was now a relentless, exhilarating sprint, and the question of how long they could sustain such a demanding, high-wire flight began to hang unspoken in the vibrant, thrumming air.
Magic Carpet was a testament to that audacity, a game that seemed to defy the very hardware it ran on. Its flowing, fractal landscapes, rendered in real time as players soared over them, felt less like pixels and more like sorcery. This was not just a game, but a public declaration of BULLFROG's technical prowess, an intoxicating vision of boundless potential. But such power, so rapidly amassed, carried its own silent weight, each impossible new world demanding more, pushing the limits of what was sustainable. But this dazzling ascent, this almost impossible run of hits, was also, by definition, a peak. And the view from a peak, however exhilarating, always offers a glimpse of what lies beyond. The year of Theme Park and Magic Carpet also brought a different kind of milestone. In 1994, Electronic Arts, their American publisher, saw more than just fit games. They saw a future, and they bought a significant stake in BULLFROG. Peter Molyneux, the dreamer, the overpromiser, the man who built worlds on whim and instinct, was given a new title, Vice President. The word itself felt heavy, almost out of place, a concrete corporate block dropped into the fluid, spontaneous architecture of BULLFROG. The genie that had granted them wishes now had a key to the front door, a subtle shift that felt like a quiet, almost imperceptible turning of the tide. The dream was still vibrant, but a new kind of gravity had entered the room. The offer came, as such things do, with a smile. Electronic Arts sent their most persuasive men, Bing Gordon, the company's longtime creative chief, and David Gardner, the architect of their European operations. They made a rational, charming case for a future with more resources, more reach. For BULLFROG, the decision to sell was never simple. Colleagues remember a blend of ambition, financial security, and plain, grinding exhaustion. There was also, as the industry consolidated, a real fear of being left behind. The reported sum, around $44 million, was a prize that seemed to secure everything. But as the ink dried on the deal, some quietly wondered what it might cost.
The offer now meant months of due diligence, as the company built on frogs and jokes was measured, valued, and finally quantified. Then, in January of 1995, it was done. Electronic Arts acquired BULLFROG Productions outright. The price, widely circulated at around $44 million, became part of the industry's lore. Yet it was a number never officially verified, a figure whispered more often than stated. For the people who truly knew, that exact sum remained a closely guarded secret for 30 years, a testament to what remained hidden even as everything changed. The champagne flowed, and fortunes were indeed made. Peter Molyneux and Les Edgar were now millionaires, their accidental company a titan of British gaming. But with the stroke of a pen, they also became employees of the world's biggest publisher, their freedom exchanged for a promise of resources. The joke, for some, was already beginning to wear thin. The company that had once seemed a wish-granting genie, publishing Populous to the world and elevating two men above a Guildford hi-fi shop to wealth and renown, now owned the lamp. Electronic Arts, their most vital partner in Act One, had transformed. The genie and the antagonist, the structural architects of their rise and fall, were always, in fact, the same character. This was the dark, unseen twist of the story, the engine of the tragedy to come. The very power that had forged BULLFROG's success would now, slowly and inexorably, begin to take it apart. Yet in that room, amidst the champagne and the promise of boundless resources, no one could have articulated it that way. The irony, brutal in hindsight, was entirely invisible. For the two men who had founded BULLFROG, this moment was a true hinge. Les Edgar, the steady hand who had navigated the contracts and the finances, had now secured their future. Peter Molyneux, the visionary whose imagination had conjured worlds, would soon find his new role within the corporate structure increasingly chafing. One had done the deal, the other, eventually, would walk away from it. What this profound shift meant for their partnership, for the friendship that had built an empire from a broom cupboard, remains unspoken in the official record. Did the partner who sold the company to the American giant truly foresee the cost? Did the partner whose creative spirit would soon yearn for escape ever fully reconcile with the terms of their shared success? The archive, so rich in other details, falls silent on this, the deepest question between two friends.
The acquisition by Electronic Arts in January 1995 promised BULLFROG security and scale. Autonomy, many recall, was the most important assurance. But the world inside the Guildford office quickly shifted. The informal rhythms of the garage band gave way to something new. The studio, post-acquisition, started to feel like a machine. Insiders described it as a chicken factory, a place where output and schedule became paramount. Development became less about playful discovery, more about process and output targets. The creative chaos that had defined BULLFROG was slowly giving way to the grind of timely delivery.
The initial promises of independence and shared vision began to fray. BULLFROG had been built on inspired chaos, on the unpredictable spark of creation. Electronic Arts, by contrast, was a global publisher, a company of systems and schedules. It was not malice, but a rational approach to a growing business. Yet the clash was fundamental. The unique alchemy that birthed Populous and Theme Park struggled against the demand for predictable output. The long, difficult birth of Dungeon Keeper would become the crucible for this new reality.
The expectations from new ownership reshaped daily life. Playful exploration gave way to a more industrial rhythm. Insiders, looking back on that period, used a stark, shared phrase to describe it.
The vivid phrase, chicken factory, spoke to a profound shift. Output now mattered more than play. The schedule dictated, not the spark. The old bullfrog culture, where everyone playing everyone's game, where chaos was method, could not thrive here. It did not die in a dramatic fight. It simply faded, slowly under the fluorescent lights of the new corporate efficiency. No one explicitly decided to kill it. It was just never written into the plan. Dungeon Keeper, the most ambitious design of Peter Molyneux's career, became the studio's crucible. Its development was troubled, extended. This was a game of grand vision, but it moved with difficulty through the new industrial process. The long hours, once born of passion, now felt like a mandate. The press, Molyneux's original Mythology Machine, began to shift its tone. Reports surfaced of his growing unhappiness, of the strain behind the studio doors. The very mechanism that had built him into a visionary was now slowly narrating his decline. The feedback loop had finally begun to run in reverse. The troubled development of Dungeon Keeper confirmed the growing whispers. Molyneux's gift for grand promises, once his charm, now became his burden. By late 1996, the founder was profoundly tired. Peter Molyneux had drafted a letter of resignation. It was a private document, a contemplation, not yet a choice. But as the story is told, a moment of accidental tragedy intervened. His friend, Tim Rance, mid-conversation at a shared computer, sent the draft, without permission. The email landed in the inbox of Larry Probst, the chief executive of Electronic Arts. 10 years of BULLFROG, a decade of brilliance, pivoted on that single unintended click. The click was a moment of accidental comedy, but the laughter would not last. It sealed his fate and BULLFROG's. Electronic Arts responded with cold corporate rationality. They asked Peter Molyneux to stay away from the Guildford office, effective immediately. This was not a dismissal. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, born of a deeper fear. EA, colleagues remember, believed that if Molyneux walked the studio's halls, the developers would follow him out the door. The founder was locked out of the family he had built. He was exiled from the company he had sold. The machine he had invited in now kept him at arm's length, even as he worked to complete Dungeon Keeper from home. The dream had become a prison, and he was its first captive. The man who had built worlds from a cramped room above a Guildford hi-fi shop was now, by corporate dictate, excluded from it. He was a founder, yet no longer allowed to walk the halls of his own creation. The most famous games designer in Britain was asked to work from home, a quiet exile from the empire he had, by accident, begun. The accidental email had done its work. Peter Molyneux found himself barred from the Guildford office, completing his most ambitious game, Dungeon Keeper, from home. The studio, by then, insiders said, felt like a chicken factory, and the founder was locked out. Accounts from the time suggest Electronic Arts threatened to pull support entirely. It was a prolonged, difficult birth for a game meant to be his masterpiece, finished at a kitchen table, at a distance, by a man already in exile. On April 26, 1997, Dungeon Keeper finally shipped. The critics called it a triumph, but the cost was immense, and the victory was Molyneux's alone. The game was a critical success, yet the company, to him, was unrecognizable. The old BULLFROG, the one he had built, had gone. This was his vision, made manifest. A world turned upside down. Players became the dungeon master, not the hero. They burrowed out their underworld, recruited monstrous creatures, and lured the virtuous to their doom. The humor was cutting, the design intricate. It was a triumph of inverse fantasy, a dark mirror to the hero's quest. Every impish laugh, every satisfying trap sprung, echoed the creative anarchy that had once defined BULLFROG. This final, dark jewel,
forged in fire, stood as testament to a spirit that refused to be broken.
In July of 1997, Peter Molyneux walked away from BULLFROG Productions. It was almost exactly 10 years since he and Les Edgar had first conjured a world-beating studio from a cramped room above a Guildford hi-fi shop. He left to found Lionhead Studios, carrying with him the ambition that had built BULLFROG and the burden of its end. His corporate owners, Electronic Arts, had already shown their hand. They had asked him to stay away, fearing he would pull vital developers with him as he plotted his next move. Now, that fear was no longer a secret. It was an open challenge. The question that hung over the entire studio was plain. Who would follow the founder out the door? The original spirit of BULLFROG, the chaotic, joyous energy, had been exiled. It was now searching for a new home, a new canvas.
With Peter Molyneux's departure, the original BULLFROG was truly finished. It was a company born of two men, the visionary and the pragmatist. Les Edgar, the steady hand, had made the deal, securing their future. Molyneux, the restless artist, now walked away. Their partnership, which had forged an empire, survived the ambition and the sale. But the company they had made, defined by chaos and joy, could not. It became a name, an IP, a production line. The founders had reached the end of their shared road.
The fear Electronic Arts had harbored was now realized. When Peter Molyneux departed, a significant portion of BULLFROG's talent left with him. Some joined him at Lionhead Studios, others moved to found Muckyfoot. Simon Carter, a core programmer, would go on to help build Big Blue Box, shaping the Fable series that became a touchstone of the next console generation. John T. Barnes, another veteran of the engine room, also joined Lionhead. Mark Healy, whose unique art had defined Dungeon Keeper, followed to Lionhead before co-founding Media Molecule, the studio behind the celebrated Little Big Planet. BULLFROG, it seemed, had always been more than a company. It was a nursery. Its deepest product was never a game, but the entire generation of studios it had seeded, now scattered across the British landscape. With its founder and so much of its talent departed, BULLFROG Productions slowly bled away. Electronic Arts, the new owner, held the intellectual property, the rights to all those famous games. But the studio itself, the creative engine, was hollowed out. By the early 2000s, the name BULLFROG was quietly retired. The catalog of games remained, a testament to what had been built. Yet the spirit that forged them, the passion, the chaos, the unique British humor, had already departed, carried away in the rucksacks of its builders. Yet one talent from that Guildford office would travel further than any other. A boy, barely 17, had sat at a corner desk, helping code the simulation for Theme Park. His name was Demis Hassabis. Decades later, that same programmer would found DeepMind, shaping the future of artificial intelligence. In 2024, the world recognized his work, awarding him a share of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for AlphaFold. The boy who taught a simulated theme park to run had, in time, taught computers to understand the very building blocks of life itself. From a room above a hi-fi shop, a future Nobel laureate had quietly begun to change the world. All the millions traded and earned, all the records broken, could not quite measure the true value forged in that cramped room. In the end, what remained was a legend and the memory of a name, BULLFROG. It was a company born from a simple misunderstanding, a misdialed number, and a co-founder's collection of ceramic frogs perched on a shelf. From that accidental beginning, it stumbled into creation, inventing the God game genre and captivating an entire nation in Japan, where it became a cultural phenomenon. It raised brilliant minds, including one who would later map the very proteins of life, earning the highest scientific honor. The company itself, that improbable collective, could not survive the weight of its own success, ultimately swallowed by the corporate machine it once partnered with. Yet for a time,
a remarkable, chaotic decade. This studio, named for a bull and a frog, was a pure, unadulterated comedy, a testament to what a few passionate people could conjure from nothing but an idea and a dream.